June 6, 1944. Inside a bunker full of human bones, a single light bulb flickered, casting dancing, skeletal shadows on the damp concrete walls. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and something else, something metallic and old. Sergeant Miles Turner of the 82nd Airborne did not lower his carbine. His breath plumed in the sudden, unnatural cold. He and his men, a ragged group of 6 who had survived the chaotic drop into Sainte-Mère-Église, only to be separated from their unit, had been following a strange, low-frequency hum. It had led them away from the sounds of battle, into a silent, wooded area where the very birds seemed afraid to sing. They had found the bunker door, a massive, rusted steel slab, slightly ajar, as if whatever was inside had left in a hurry or was inviting them in. The bones were not arranged as if in a mass grave. They were not piled neatly. They were scattered as if from a tremendous explosion, yet there were no blast marks, no scorching. Femurs lay crossed with rib cages. Skulls, some with helmets still perched precariously upon them, stared out from corners with vacant sockets. They were not all German or all American. Uniform fragments from both sides, and others, were mingled together in a ghastly post-mortem fraternity. This was not a field hospital, nor an execution site. It felt like a larder, a place where things had been stored. "Sweet Jesus," Private Miller whispered, his voice cracking. He was the youngest of them, barely 19, and the weight of the Normandy night had already aged his face by a decade. He pointed a trembling finger. Among the bones, half hidden under a tattered field jacket bearing the insignia of the Wehrmacht, was a stack of metal canisters. They were not for ammunition. They were sleek, cylindrical, and made of a dull, non-reflective metal that seemed to drink the dim light. Wires, thin and coppery, snaked from their bases into a central console that looked like no radio any of them had ever seen. This was the source of the hum. A low, resonant thrum that was not so much heard as felt in the teeth and the bones. It was a sound that promised a headache, that whispered of wrongness. Sergeant Turner took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching on something that was not stone. He did not look down. "Jenkins, keep watch on that door. Don't let it shut." "Yes, Sergeant." Jenkins replied, his own rifle trained on the sliver of twilight visible through the entrance. The outside world, with its familiar terrors of mortars and machine guns, now seemed impossibly distant and safe. Turner knelt, ignoring the protest of his knees and the cold seeping through his uniform. He reached for one of the canisters. It was ice-cold to the touch, a deep, penetrating cold that felt unnatural in the early June air. Etched into its side was not a German eagle or a serial number, but a symbol he had never seen before, a circle, bisected by 3 jagged lines that resembled lightning bolts, but were not. They were more like cracks in reality. And then he saw the logbook. It was lying open on the console, its pages filled with dense, spidery German script. But it was the cover that stopped his heart. Stamped into the worn leather, clear even in the flickering light, were the letters AVNGER, Avalon Group. The name meant nothing to the army, to intelligence, to anyone in the official chain of command, but to Turner it was a ghost. A name whispered in the same breath as the lost patrols, the silent transmissions, the missions that were scrubbed from the record before the ink was even dry. He had heard it only once before, from a dying OSS operative in a London pub in 1943, a man who had babbled about time locks and echoes before a bullet he never saw coming had silenced him forever. Turner had reported it, of course. He was told it was nonsense, the ravings of a man who had been under too long. He had almost believed them. Now, in this charnel house bunker in Normandy, he knew it was all true. He flipped through the pages. The dates were recent, up until a few days ago. The entries were technical, filled with terms he did not understand. Temporal resonance, chronal displacement, phase synchronization. And then, the objective, stated with chilling bureaucratic clarity. Project Januskopf, Project Janus Head. The mission. Not to change the past. The logs argued that was a theoretical impossibility, a self-correcting paradox. The goal was to observe, to send scouts, observers, forward and backward, to gather intelligence from the future of the war and from the pivotal moments of its past. They had been trying to win the war by looking at the entire timeline at once, but something had gone wrong. The last entry, scrawled in a frantic, panicked hand, was different. Synchronization failed. The gate did not close. They are not coming back. They are elsewhere, elsewhen. The observers are lost. The signal is corrupted. We hear them screaming, but the screams are from yesterday and tomorrow. The field is unstable. It is pulling everything in. We are abandoning the facility. God help us. We have opened a door that cannot be closed. The bones are what it leaves behind. Turner's blood ran colder than the metal canister in his hand. He looked up at his men, their faces pale and strained in the flickering light. They were not just lost behind enemy lines. They were standing in the heart of something far more dangerous than the entire German army. They were standing in a machine that was still running, a machine that was broken, a machine that was eating people and spitting out their skeletons across time. "Sergeant?" Miller asked, his voice small. "What is this place?" Before Turner could form a lie, a sound echoed from the depths of the bunker, a place beyond the circle of light. It was not the hum. It was a voice, faint, distorted, as if coming from a great distance through a poor radio connection. It was a voice screaming in English. "The trees! The trees are on fire! I can see the sea! It's not the channel! The sky is wrong, the sky is!" The voice cut off with a wet, final crunch, followed by a burst of static that sounded, for a single, horrifying second, like a human sob. Then, the single light bulb flared into blinding whiteness and exploded, plunging them into absolute darkness. The hum intensified, vibrating up through the soles of their boots, into their spines. From the doorway, Jenkins let out a sharp cry. "Sergeant, the door! It's moving!" In the pitch black, surrounded by the bones of men who had been torn from their own time, Sergeant Turner knew one thing for certain. Their mission was no longer about finding their unit. It was no longer about the D-Day invasion. It was about survival in a way no soldier had ever been trained for. They were trapped in the belly of Project Januskopf, and it was hungry. The most terrifying mission of the war had just begun, and they were its newest, unwilling participants. The darkness was not just an absence of light. It was a physical presence, thick and heavy, a velvet shroud that pressed in on them from all sides. The only constant was the hum, which was no longer a background nuisance. It was the bunker's heartbeat, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very concrete, from the bones littering the floor, from the air itself. It was a sound that promised madness if you listened to it for too long. "Nobody move," Turner barked, his voice cutting through the suffocating black. "Sound off. Miller, here," a shaky voice to his left. "Jenkins, by the door. It's shut, Sarge. I can't find a handle on this side. Carter, here. Rodriguez. O'Malley. Schmidt." The last voice was tight with a control the others lacked. Erich Schmidt was their token, their unexpected asset. A German Jew who had fled in 1938, fought his way through paperwork and prejudice to join the American army, and was now their interpreter and their window into the enemy's mind. He was also the most level-headed of the group. "Schmidt," Turner said, his mind racing, fighting the primal fear that threatened to freeze him in place. "That logbook. What the hell is Project Januskopf?" In the darkness, Schmidt's voice was calm, analytical. "Janus, the Roman god of beginnings and endings, gates, doorways, transitions. He is depicted with two faces, one looking to the past, one to the future. Januskopf, the head of Janus, a two-headed project, observing the past and future," Turner muttered, the words tasting like ash. He fumbled in his pocket for his Zippo lighter. The click was unnaturally loud. The small flame that sprang to life was a tiny, defiant sun in the infinite black. It illuminated their faces, pale and wide-eyed, and cast long, leaping shadows that made the bones seem to twitch and move. The door was indeed shut. It was a seamless, solid wall of steel now. Jenkins was running his hands over it, his movements frantic. "Nothing, Sarge. No seam, no latch, no nothing. It's like it was never there." Forget the door for now, Turner ordered, his voice low. We need to find the power, or a way to shut that hum off. He held the lighter higher, its flame guttering in a draught he couldn't feel. The bunker was larger than he'd first thought. The circle of light revealed corridors leading off into deeper darkness. The central console with its strange canisters was the heart of this room, but the arteries of the place ran deep. The voice they had heard. It had come from one of those corridors. The screaming, Miller said, his voice trembling. That was American. Who was that? I don't know, son, Turner said. And it was the truth. He looked at the logbook, still open on the console. But we're going to find out. Schmidt, you're with me. Carter, Rodriguez, you two search this main room. Look for another exit, a control panel, anything. Jenkins, O'Malley, you guard this console. Miller, you stick with me. He didn't add the rest of the thought, the order that was in all their minds. Don't touch anything. The air was already charged with enough unseen danger. With Schmidt at his side and Miller trailing nervously behind, Turner moved toward the corridor from which the screaming had emanated. The lighter's flame was a poor tool, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The corridor was narrow, lined with more of the same damp concrete. The hum was louder here, the vibration more intense. It was like walking into the throat of some vast, slumbering beast. They passed doorways. The first opened into a small barracks room, bunks neatly made, personal effects on nightstands. A photograph of a smiling woman and a little girl next to a half-finished cup of coffee. The normality of it was more chilling than the bones. Life had been here, recently. It had been interrupted mid-breath. The second doorway led to a laboratory. Beakers and glass tubing lay shattered on the floor. A blackboard was covered in complex equations, most of which had been hastily scrubbed out. One phrase remained, circled again and again in frantic white chalk. Der Beobachter-Effekt. The observer-effect. Schmidt paused, staring at the phrase. In physics, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. The observer effect is the theory that the act of observation changes the thing being observed. What does that mean for time? Turner asked, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. It would mean, Schmidt said slowly, that they were not just watching. Their very presence in the past, or the future, was altering it, perhaps in small ways, perhaps in catastrophic ones. The third doorway was different. It was reinforced steel, like the main entrance, but this one was sealed shut by a massive hand-cranked wheel, like something from the vault of a bank or a submarine. And from the gap beneath the door, a faint, pulsing, bluish light bled into the corridor. It was accompanied by a new sound, a crackling, sizzling noise, like static electricity on a global scale. This was the source. This was the heart of the hum. Turner approached the door cautiously. The metal was cold, but the air around it was charged, making the hairs on his arm stand up. He put his ear to the cold steel. He heard it then. Not a scream, but a chorus of whispers. Dozens, hundreds of them, layered over one another, a cacophony of fragmented speech. He heard German, English, French, languages he couldn't identify. He heard shouts of orders, cries of terror, the crackle of radio transmissions, the roar of aircraft engines, the thunder of artillery. It was a soundscape of the entire war, playing all at once, a temporal traffic jam of noise and suffering, and beneath it all the relentless, hungry pull of the hum. My God, he breathed. What is it, Sarge? Miller asked, his face a mask of terror. Turner didn't answer. He looked at the wheel. It was meant to be turned. To open this door. To see what was on the other side. It was the most terrifying idea he had ever entertained. Back in the main chamber, Carter and Rodriguez had found something. Sarge, over here, Carter called out. It's another log, a personal one. They had discovered a small office, tucked away behind a stack of crates marked with the same 3 cracked circle symbol. On the desk was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with a more personal, cursive script. It belonged to a Dr. Klaus Reichenbach, the chief scientist of Project Januskopf. Schmidt took the journal and began to read aloud, his voice a grim monotone that cut through the oppressive hum. Entry dated May 5th, 1944. The success is beyond our wildest dreams. We have stabilized the field for periods of up to 17 minutes. Observer Team Gamma was sent forward to a temporal coordinate we have designated T+30. They returned, changed, haunted. They spoke of a silent world, a Europe in ruins, but not from our war. They spoke of cities made of crystal, of a sky that burned with a green Sunday. Their Geiger counters were silent. It was not radiation. It was something else. Something other. They brought back a sample, a piece of that crystal. It sings to the machine. It wants to go home. Turner felt a fresh wave of dread. They weren't just looking at their own future. They were peeking into others, into possibilities. Schmidt turned the page. Entry dated May 18th, 1944. Observer Team Delta was sent back. A simple mission. Observe the Roman fortifications in Gaul, circa 58 BC. A test of historical resolution. They never arrived, or rather, they arrived. Elsewhere. We received a fragmented transmission. It was Delta Leader, screaming about iron birds and giants in the sky. The temporal coordinates were corrupted. We believe they manifested in the middle of a battlefield in 1917, the Great War. We pulled them back, or what was left of them. 2 men returned. Their bodies were riddled with bullet wounds that were hours old, yet they had only been gone for 3 minutes of our time. They died babbling about mud and poison gas. The past is not a static picture. It is a storm, and we are flying a kite in it. The entries went on, each more desperate than the last. Reichenbach's scientific curiosity was being eroded by a growing, palpable horror. He wrote of chronal ghosts, faint after, images of the observers flickering in and out of existence in the bunker. He wrote of equipment failing for no reason, of watches running backward, of soldiers reporting conversations with men who had been dead for days. Entry dated June 2nd, 1944. The field is becoming sentient. It learns. It hungers. It no longer needs the console to activate. It pulls things through on its own. Private Hofel was on guard duty last night. He was found this morning. Or rather, a version of him was found. He was aged 80 years, his uniform rotted to dust, mumbling about the fall of Berlin in 1945. An hour later, another Hofel appeared, a boy of 12, crying for his mother. They faded away within minutes, screaming as they were pulled back into the stream. The field is not a doorway, it is a wound, and we are the infection. Miller was crying now, silent tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Carter and Rodriguez exchanged looks of sheer, unadulterated terror. This was beyond combat. This was a violation of reality itself. Final entry, June 4th, 1944. The synchronization matrix has failed catastrophically. The crystal sample from the future, it is not inert. It is a key or a beacon. It has locked onto its point of origin and is pulling the field toward it. We cannot shut it down. The door is open, and we cannot close it. It is pulling everything toward that green Sunday. We are evacuating. I have ordered the destruction of all records, but I cannot bring myself to burn this journal. Let it be a testament. Let someone know that we reached for God's watch and broke it. The bones. You will see the bones. They are the ones the field could not fully digest. They are the echoes of men trapped between ticks of the clock. God forgive us. Silence descended upon the group, broken only by the crackle of the lighter and the incessant, mocking hum. They had their answer. They were not in a bunker. They were in the stomach of a time beast, and it was still very, very hungry. The decision was made for them. From the sealed steel door at the end of the corridor, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic, metallic clanging. Something was on the other side. Something was trying to get out. Clang, clang, clang. It was heavy, deliberate. Jenkins, who had been guarding the console, backed away, his rifle coming up. Sarge! That door, the massive hand-cranked wheel began to turn. It moved slowly, jerkily, as if being turned by a tremendous, unsteady force. The metal groaned in protest. The pulsing blue light from beneath the door flared, strobing through the corridor, painting their terrified faces in stark, alternating flashes of light and shadow. Turner raised his carbine, his mind screaming, his training the only thing holding him together. "Positions! Everyone! On that door! Whatever comes through, you fire until you're out of ammo." The 7 men formed a ragged semicircle, weapons trained on the steel vault. The clanging stopped, the wheels ceased turning. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only the hum and the crackle of energy. Then, with a final, deafening shriek of tortured metal, the door swung inward. There was no one there. The doorway was filled with a blinding, swirling vortex of blue and white light. It was not a room. It was a storm. A tunnel of howling energy, a maelstrom of stolen moments. Within the light, they could see fleeting images, like fragments of a shattered film reel, a biplane spinning out of control, a Roman legionary raising his shield, a mushroom cloud boiling into the sky, a knight in full-plate armor falling from his horse, the crystal cities under a green Sunday. The images flashed and vanished, superimposed over one another in a dizzying, horrifying collage. This was the gate, this was the wound, and standing at the threshold, silhouetted against the raging temporal storm, was a figure. It was a man, or it had been a man. He wore the tattered remains of a US Army uniform, but it was from another unit one Turner didn't recognize. The fabric was faded, as if bleached by 1,000 suns. In one hand he held a Thompson submachine gun, its stock splintered. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with a madness that was not of this world. He was staring at them, but not seeing them. He was looking through them, at something only he could see. He took a stumbling step forward, out of the light and into the corridor. The air around him shimmered, like heat haze on a desert road. The trees!" The man rasped, his voice a dry, rustling thing. It was the same voice they had heard screaming earlier. "They're all on fire. The sky. It's bleeding. Can't you see it? The sky is bleeding." He raised his Thompson, not at them, but at the empty air beside Turner. "Get back! Get away from me, you devils!" He fired a deafening burst. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the concrete wall, missing Turner by inches. The soldiers flinched, but held their fire. This wasn't an enemy. This was a victim. "Soldier!" Turner yelled, lowering his weapon and holding up a hand. "Stand down! We're Americans. We're here to help you." The man's head swiveled towards Turner, his eyes slowly focusing. A flicker of recognition, of sanity, seemed to break through the madness. "American? You're real." "Oh, we're real," Turner said, taking a cautious step forward. "What's your name, soldier? What unit are you from?" "Name," the man muttered, shaking his head. "Kessler. Sergeant Frank Kessler. Operation. Kronos. They said it was a one-way ticket. They lied. It's a merry-go-round. Round and round and round." He began to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that was worse than his screaming. "Operation Kronos. Another ghost, a deeper one." Kessler's form flickered. For a split second he was transparent. Turner could see the wall behind him. Then he solidified again, but he was different. A bloody gash now appeared on his forehead, dripping down his face. His uniform was suddenly wet, as if he'd been standing in the rain. "The storm," Kessler whispered, his laughter dying. "The storm is coming. It takes you apart. It puts you back together wrong. I've been to the Somme. I've seen the pyramids being built. I was at Gettysburg. I'm always there. I can't leave. The door won't let me leave." He looked past them, towards the main chamber, his eyes widening in fresh terror. "They're coming. The others. The ones who didn't make it back to the door. The echoes." From the swirling light of the gateway, more figures were emerging. They were faint, translucent, like projections on smoke. A German soldier from the Great War, his Pickelhaube helmet askew, bayoneting an enemy that wasn't there. A knight swinging a massive sword at an unseen foe. A modern infantryman crouched and firing his M1 Garand. They were ghosts, trapped in their final, fatal moments, playing them out over and over again in an endless, hellish loop. They were the chronal ghosts Reichenbach had written about, the bunker's permanent, tormented residents. They began to move down the corridor, not as attackers, but as forces of nature, like a tide of suffering. They passed through the solid concrete walls, through crates, through the living soldiers who stood frozen in horror. Miller screamed as the night passed directly through him. He collapsed, clutching his chest, his face a mask of agony. "Cold! So cold!" The German soldier from 1916 walked through Rodriguez, who suddenly gasped, his hands flying to his throat, choking on phantom poison gas. They were not physical, but their trauma was. Their dying moments were a contagion. "Fall back!" Turner roared, snapping out of his paralysis. "To the main chamber, now!" They stumbled back, dragging a sobbing Miller and a disoriented Rodriguez. The ghostly procession continued, spilling out into the bone-littered room, their silent screams adding a new, psychic layer to the horror. The air grew colder. The light from Turner's Zippo guttered and died, unable to be relit. The only illumination now was the erratic, strobing blue from the open gateway and the faint, sickly green glow coming from the central console, the crystal, the sample from the future. It was pulsing in time with the gateway, its song a siren's call to the storm. Kessler, the temporal castaway, stood in the middle of the chaos, his Thompson hanging limply from its sling. He was looking at the console, at the pulsing green crystal. "The key," he mumbled. "It's the key. It wants to go home. It's pulling us all with it." He started walking towards the console, his movements jerky, puppet-like. "Kessler, no!" Turner shouted. But it was too late. Kessler reached the console. He didn't touch the crystal. Instead, he looked at the controls, his hands hovering over the unfamiliar dials and switches. A strange clarity came into his eyes. "It's a resonance loop," he said, his voice suddenly calm, lucid. The madness was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of a man who has seen his death and accepted it. The crystal and the gate, they're feeding each other, amplifying each other. It's going to rupture. It's going to pull this entire area into the storm, permanently. He looked at Turner, his gaze clear and direct for the first time. "You have to break the loop." "How?" Turner demanded, his mind racing. "Do we destroy the crystal?" "No," Kessler said sharply. "That would be like cutting a rope while hanging from a cliff. The release of energy would be unimaginable. It would vaporize everything for miles. You have to desynchronize them." The console controls the field's frequency. The crystal is tuned to its home. You have to retune the console, create a dissonance, a counter-frequency that will push the gate closed. "I don't know how to do that," Turner yelled over the rising whine of the gateway and the moans of the chronal ghosts. "I do," Kessler said. A sad, weary smile touched his lips. "I've been riding the frequencies for what feels like 1,000 years. I know this machine. It's the same one that took me." He looked down at his own flickering hands. "But it requires a stable anchor, a fixed point in the stream, a living consciousness, hardwired into the console, to guide the frequency shift, a human regulator." Understanding dawned on Turner, cold and terrible. "You'll be trapped." "I'm already trapped, Sergeant," Kessler said softly. "This is the only way I get to go home. This is my one-way ticket. Let me do this. Get your men to the far wall. It might contain the backlash." There was no time to argue. The ghostly figures were becoming more solid. The bones on the floor were beginning to vibrate, to skitter and dance. A low roar was building from the gateway, the sound of 1,000 timelines tearing apart. "Do it," Turner ordered. He turned to his men. "Everyone, against the far wall. Now, cover your eyes and heads." They scrambled back, pressing themselves against the cold concrete. Turner looked back one last time. Kessler was seated at the console, his hands moving confidently over the controls, wiring 2 bare copper leads to the main terminal, and then clamping the other ends to the bare skin of his wrists. He didn't flinch. He closed his eyes. "Frequency shift initiating," he said, his voice calm, almost serene. "Godspeed, Sergeant." He threw a massive switch. The world exploded in light and sound. The hum became a deafening shriek. The blue light from the gateway flared white, so bright it was painful even through closed eyelids. The chronal ghosts shrieked in unison, a sound of pure temporal agony, and then they vanished, winked out of existence. The bones on the floor lifted into the air, swirling in a frenzied vortex. The console sparked and smoked, the smell of ozone and burnt wiring filling the air. Turner risked a glance. Kessler was rigid in the chair, his back arched, his mouth open in a silent scream. Light was pouring from his eyes, his mouth, his very pores. He was a conduit for forces no human was ever meant to channel. He was burning up from the inside out, his life force being used as fuel to shut the door he had helped to open. The shriek from the gateway began to change pitch, sliding down the scale from a scream to a roar, to a rumble, to a groan. The swirling light collapsed in on itself, pulling away from the corridor like a retreating tide. The pulsing green crystal on the console flared one last time, a final, defiant flash, and then it shattered into a million inert, dull fragments. The roar ceased. The light vanished. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was the most profound, the most absolute, the most terrifying sound Miles Turner had ever heard. It was the silence of a vacuum, the silence of a place where time itself had died. Slowly, shakily, he lowered his hands from his ears. The bunker was dark. The only light came from the weak beam of a single flashlight one of his men had managed to turn on. The gateway was gone. The steel door at the end of the corridor was now just a door, closed and silent. The console was a blackened, ruined husk. The bones lay still, once again just bones. Of Sergeant Frank Kessler there was no sign. No body, no ash. He was just gone. He had paid his one-way ticket. For a long time no one spoke. They just sat there, in the deafening silence, trying to comprehend what had just happened. They had faced an enemy that bullets could not kill, a terror that was not of flesh and blood. They had looked into the abyss of time, and it had looked back. Finally, Turner pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt like rubber. "Is everyone okay?" His voice was a hoarse croak. A chorus of shaky affirmatives answered him. Miller was still trembling, but he was alive. Rodriguez was rubbing his throat, the memory of the gas fading. Jenkins pointed his flashlight at the main entrance. Sarge, the door. The massive steel slab was open again. A sliver of pre-dawn light, the clean, honest light of June 6, 1944, filtered into the bunker. The way out was open. They stumbled out of the bunker, one by one, like men leaving a tomb. The air was fresh, cool, and smelled of dew and earth. In the distance, the rumble of the Normandy invasion was a constant, reassuring thunder. The world was still at war. Their war. Turner took one last look back into the darkness. He thought of the logbook, of Reichenbach's journal, of Kessler's sacrifice. He thought of the Avalon Group and Operation Kronos. These were secrets that were never meant to be known. They were truths that could break a man's mind, that could change the world in ways far more fundamental than any political victory. He made a decision. "Carter, Rodriguez," he said, his voice firm now, the voice of a sergeant. "Get those journals. All of them." He walked back into the bunker, ignoring the chill that ran down his spine. He gathered the official logbook and Reichenbach's personal journal. He then went to the blackened console and, using the butt of his carbine, smashed the remaining components beyond recognition. He kicked the shattered fragments of the green crystal, scattering them into the dust. He rejoined his men outside. He took the journals and, finding a shallow crater, he doused them with the last of his canteen water and a little gasoline from a spare canister. He lit a match. The papers caught fire quickly, the flames hungry, consuming the terrible knowledge they contained. The secrets of Project Januskopf, the horrors of the temporal wound, the fate of Sergeant Kessler, all turned to ash and smoke. What do we report, Sarge?" Miller asked, watching the flames. Turner watched the last page of Reichenbach's journal curl and blacken. "We report nothing," he said flatly. "We found an abandoned German communications bunker. It was empty. We rejoined our unit. That's all." "But Kessler, the others," Miller protested weakly. There was no Kessler, Turner said, his gaze boring into each of his men in turn. There were no others. There were no bones. There was no machine. We never saw anything. We never heard anything. Is that understood? He saw the understanding dawn in their eyes. The terror they had experienced was nothing compared to the terror of that knowledge getting out. It was a burden they would have to carry alone, to their graves. It was a secret that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives, but it was a secret that had to be kept. One by one they nodded. Their faces were grim, aged far beyond their years. They were no longer just paratroopers. They were guardians of a terrible, silent truth. As they moved out, heading towards the sound of the guns, Turner took one last look at the bunker entrance, a dark scar in the earth. He had closed a door today, but he had opened another inside his own mind, a door behind which lurked the infinite, screaming chaos of broken time. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that the Avalon group was still out there, that Operation Kronos had other teams, that the war against the Axis was only one front in a much larger, much darker conflict. A conflict for the very fabric of history itself. And he knew, with a soldier's grim resignation, that his part in it was not over. October 16th, 1944. The silence in the room was thicker than the fog that clung to the London rooftops outside. It was the silence of polished desks, of locked filing cabinets, of secrets buried under layers of official denial. Sergeant Miles Turner sat on a hard wooden chair, his hands resting on his knees, his back straight as a rifle barrel. He was clean-shaven, his uniform pressed, but his eyes held a permanent shadow, a hollowed-out look that no amount of sleep could erase. He had been in this room, or ones like it, for weeks. The debriefing was endless, a circular river of questions designed to find cracks, inconsistencies, the slightest hint of madness. Across from him sat a man who was not a man, but a title. He was introduced only as Mr. Albright. He wore a civilian suit of dark, unremarkable wool, and his face was a study in bland neutrality. He had the calm, patient demeanour of a psychiatrist and the cold, assessing eyes of an executioner. "Let us return to the crystal, Sergeant," Albright said, his voice soft, almost conversational. He never took notes. Turner knew another man, hidden behind a two-way mirror, was doing that. "You described it as singing. It was a vibration, sir. A hum you felt more than heard. It pulsed with a green light, and you are certain it shattered." "Yes, sir. When the event was over, it was just dust, and the console was destroyed, by your own hand. It was a hazard, sir." Compromised, Albright steepled his fingers. "A hazard, yes, and the journals of Dr. Reichenbach. You burned them. They were German intelligence, sir. It seemed the secure thing to do." Turner kept his voice flat, neutral. He recited the lies he and his men had agreed upon, the story they had carved into their minds until it felt like the truth. Empty bunker. Rejoined unit. Nothing of value. Albright was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Turner. The only sound was the faint tick of a clock on the mantelpiece. Turner fought the urge to fidget. He focused on a small, faded watermark on the wallpaper behind Albright's head. He had been focusing on it for 3 days. "Sergeant," Albright began again, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. It was no longer probing, it was stating a fact. The unit you were separated from on the 6th of June was part of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Your objective was to secure the western approaches to Sainte-Mère-Église. "Yes, sir. A vital objective, a chaotic night. Yet you and your squad deviated from your assigned path. According to your initial, and may I say, more candid report, you were following a sound, a low-frequency hum." Turner said nothing. His mouth was dry. "That is an interesting detail," Albright continued. "Because that particular frequency, Sergeant, is not something a standard-issue American carbine radio can pick up. It is not something the human ear is typically attuned to. It is, however, a known signature, a fingerprint, if you will." Turner's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He kept his face a mask. "We have a file," Albright said, leaning forward slightly. The movement was small, but in the static room, it felt like a seismic shift. It is a very thin file. It has no official designation. Those of us who are aware of it call it the Avalon Group file. The name hung in the air between them, toxic and undeniable. Turner's carefully constructed facade of ignorance threatened to crumble. He had spoken that name to no one. He had burned the evidence. "You look surprised, Sergeant," Albright said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "You shouldn't be. You are not the first soldier to stumble into one of their work sites. You are, however, one of the very few to walk out of one, and the only one to have apparently triggered a Class 3 temporal anomaly containment event. The terms were alien, bureaucratic, yet they described the hell in that bunker with chilling accuracy. Turner could only stare. "We know about Project Januskopf," Albright said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We know about Operation Kronos. What we did not know was the location of their primary field research site in Normandy, until you led us right to it." He opened a drawer in the desk and slid out a single photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough. It showed the bunker entrance, the same one Turner and his men had fled. But in the photograph, it was surrounded by figures in stark, white, hooded CBRN suits. They were loading a long, metallic crate into a truck. "This was taken 36 hours after you filed your report with your battalion's CO, Albright said. "A report which was flagged and which found its way to my desk. We secured the site. What we found was instructive." "You went back in?" Turner asked, his voice a rasp. "No, Sergeant. We conducted a forensic analysis. The residual chronometric radiation was off the scale. It will be uninhabitable for decades, perhaps centuries. And we recovered one item of particular interest. From the console you supposedly destroyed." He slid another photograph across the polished wood. It was a close-up of a melted, twisted piece of machinery. Fused into the metal, barely legible, was a serial number, and next to it, stamped into a surviving plate, was a manufacturer's logo. It wasn't German. It wasn't any logo Turner had ever seen. It was a stylized R and G intertwined with a caduceus. "The Avalon Group does not belong to any nation, Sergeant," Albright said, his voice cold and hard now. "They are a transnational entity, a parasite on the timeline. They were using Nazi resources to further their own ends. And now, they know we know about that site. They know that you know." Turner felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The war outside was vast, but it had borders, fronts, a defined enemy. This was a shadow war, without rules or borders, against an enemy that could be anywhere, anywhen. "Why are you telling me this?" Turner asked. "Because, Sergeant, you are no longer being debriefed," Albright said, closing the file folder with a soft, final thud. "You are being recruited. The men you came out of that bunker with, they can return to the war. They will carry their secret, and we will monitor them. But you have a unique contamination. The temporal energy in that bunker has left a mark on you, a signature. It makes you useful. Useful for what? We are forming a new unit. A deniable, off-the-books operation. Its purpose is to find Avalon Group facilities, disrupt their operations, and recover their technology. We are calling it Operation Looking Glass. And we need men who have seen the other side of the mirror and lived to tell the tale. Men who won't break when the sky starts bleeding." Albright stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "You have no choice in this, Sergeant Turner. Your war has changed. The battlefield is no longer France or Germany. The battlefield is time itself, and you have just been drafted." He was given a new uniform, without insignia. He was assigned to a barren barracks on the outskirts of London, a place that didn't exist on any map. He was introduced to the other, recruits. They were a haunted gallery of men. A British commando who had vanished for 3 days during the raid on Dieppe and returned with no memory, but whose watch now ran backward. A Russian sniper who claimed to have seen the ruins of Stalingrad rebuilt in glass and steel before the battle had even ended. A quiet American pilot who had flown a P-51 Mustang through a shimmering cloud over the Ruhr Valley and landed with fuel tanks still full, but a logbook that listed his flight time as 72 hours instead of 2. They were the broken, the touched, the witnesses. They were the only soldiers who could fight this war. Their training was not about firearms or fieldcraft. It was about perception. They were shown Rorschach blots that subtly moved. They were made to listen to audio static until they could pick out the faint, screaming whispers hidden within. They were taught to recognize the feel of a place that was temporally unstable, the way light bent wrong, the way sounds were muffled or amplified, the pervasive sense of déjà vu that was not a feeling, but a warning. Their commander was a Professor Alistair Finch, a man from Oxford who had been plucked from his dusty office and thrust into the heart of this madness. He was a theorist, a man of ideas, and he looked upon the soldiers not as warriors, but as fascinating, tragic specimens. The Avalon Group operates on a principle they call temporal Darwinism, Finch explained one day, pointing to a chalkboard covered in equations. They believe history is not a straight line, but a tree of infinite possibilities. Their goal is to prune the branches, to eliminate timelines that are unfavorable to their vision of the future, and to cultivate the one that gives them ultimate power. They are not trying to win the war for the Nazis, gentlemen. They are trying to win the war for themselves, in a future we cannot even imagine. Turner listened, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of it. This was beyond patriotism, beyond ideology. This was a bid for godhood. Their first mission came in late November, 1944. Intelligence, gathered from fragmented signals and the ravings of captured Avalon scientists, pointed to a facility in the Ardennes forest. The same forest where, in a matter of weeks, the Germans would launch their massive counter-offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. The report suggested the Avalon Group was not just observing this coming battle, they were preparing to actively manipulate it. The team was inserted behind enemy lines in a driving sleet storm. There were 5 of them. Turner, the British commando named Wallace, the Russian sniper called Petrenko, and 2 others, a quiet Canadian engineer named Macready, and their communications expert, a young woman from the SOE known only as Lynx. They moved like ghosts through the frozen pines, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The facility was not a bunker this time. It was a medieval castle, its stones weathered and dark, perched on a crag overlooking a deep river valley. According to Finch, the castle was built on a temporal ley line, a place where the barrier between times was naturally thin. The Avalon Group had fortified it, adding modern generators and antennae that sprouted from its ancient towers like metallic ivy. Their objective was to infiltrate, plant explosives on the main resonator, the machine amplifying the temporal field, and gather any intelligence they could before exfiltrating. Getting inside was surprisingly easy. Too easy. The outer walls were unguarded. The main gate was open a crack. A sense of profound wrongness settled over Turner the moment they crossed the threshold. The courtyard was empty, swept clean, but the air was warm, unnaturally so for the depths of winter. And the light had a strange golden quality, like a perpetual hazy afternoon. Chronal displacement field is active, Lynx whispered, checking a bulky meter she carried. It's weak, but it's everywhere. It's smoothing things over, hiding the edges. They moved into the great hall. Suits of armor stood along the walls, but as Turner passed one, he saw its visor was not a slit of darkness, but contained 2 deep, intelligent eyes that tracked his movement. He froze, his carbine coming up. The eyes blinked, slowly, and then looked away, as if bored. "Did you see that?" he hissed to Wallace. "See what?" Wallace replied, his own eyes scanning the shadows. "Nothing but dust and old metal, mate." Turner said nothing. The field was affecting them differently. He was more sensitive. They found the central chamber in the castle's keep. It was a horrifying fusion of the ancient and the advanced. Stone arches supported a ceiling from which hung massive, crystalline structures that pulsed with the same green light Turner had seen in Normandy. In the centre of the room was not a console, but a massive stone chair, like a throne. Wires and tubes snaked from it into the floor, and seated on the throne was a man in a white lab coat, his head lolled back, a thin stream of blood trickling from his nose. Laying the charges was Macready's job. He moved with efficient grace, setting the shaped explosives around the base of the crystalline array. Petrenko took up a position at the door, his rifle trained on the corridor. Lynx began hooking her equipment into the Avalon Group's own terminals, downloading data directly. Turner approached the throne. The man in the lab coat was dead, his skin cold. In his lap was a notebook. Turner picked it up. The script was the same spidery German as Reichenbach's journal. The stabilization field is holding. We have successfully anchored the point of divergence. December 19th, 1944. The German spearhead will not stall at the Meuse. We have provided them with atmospheric data, Allied transmission codes, and the precise location of the US fuel depot at Stavelot. With that fuel, they will reach Antwerp. The timeline will branch. Our desired future becomes 92% probable. The sacrifice of the observers is acceptable. The end justifies the means. Turner's blood ran cold. They weren't just observing the Battle of the Bulge. They were engineering a German victory. They were creating a new, darker branch of history. "Macready, how much longer?" he called out, his voice tight. 2 minutes, Sarge. Almost done. The download on Lynx's machine hit 100%. She began unplugging the heavy reels of tape. "Got it! Let's move!" It was then that the lights died, not a power failure. The green light from the crystals did not fade. Instead it brightened, intensifying, casting the room in a ghastly emerald glow. The hum returned, that same deep, resonant thrum that Turner felt in his very soul. From the shadows at the far end of the chamber, a figure stepped forward. It was not a ghost. It was a man. Tall. Wearing a long, dark coat over a suit. He had sharp, aristocratic features and hair the colour of silver. His eyes were the most striking thing about him. They were pale, almost colourless, and held a depth of knowledge and weariness that was ancient. "I am Director Valerius," the man said, his voice calm, melodic, and devoid of any discernible accent. "Of the Avalon Group. You are the survivors of the Normandy incident. We have been expecting you." He gestured casually, and the suits of armour lining the walls stepped forward from their pedestals. Their movements were not jerky or robotic, but fluid, organic. They drew massive, great swords that should have been ceremonial, but now gleamed with a deadly, sharp edge. "Your intervention is noted," Valerius said, as if commenting on the weather. "And, as always, factored into the equation. You see, your attempt to stop us here is the catalyst. The paradox is beautiful. Your actions in this moment create the very intelligence leak that led you here, a self-fulfilling prophecy. You cannot win." Petrenko fired. The shot echoed deafeningly in the stone chamber. The bullet struck one of the advancing armor suits in the chest plate, sparking off it. The thing did not stagger. It kept coming. "Their armor is temporally phased," Lynx shouted. "Our weapons are useless." Valerius smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "You fight with bullets. We fight with causality. It is no contest." The armoured knights advanced, their heavy footfalls echoing. Macready had his detonator in hand. "The charges are set. We have to go now." Turner looked at Valerius, at the cold, superior certainty in his eyes. He thought of Kessler, burning up to close a door. He thought of the bones in the Normandy bunker. He would not be another pawn in their game. "Blow it," Turner said. Macready didn't hesitate. He pressed the plunger. The explosion was not of fire and concussive force, but of light and screaming reality. The shaped charges did not shatter the crystals. They disrupted the field. The green light flared into blinding whiteness. The stone chamber seemed to stretch, to warp. The advancing armoured suits flickered, their forms becoming transparent, insubstantial. One moment they were there, the next they were piles of rusted, centuries-old metal collapsing into dust. Valerius did not flinch. He stood amidst the chaos, his form shimmering. "A temporary setback, Sergeant Turner," his voice echoed, though his lips did not move. "We have already won. The branch is seeded. You will see. You will all see. The green sun awaits your arrival." And then he was gone. Vanished. The castle around them groaned. Stones began to shift in the walls, not from the explosion, but from rapid, accelerated decay. The golden light faded, replaced by the cold, grey gloom of a Belgian winter. "The field is collapsing," Lynx yelled. "The whole place is coming down!" They ran. They fled the keep, through the crumbling great hall, out into the courtyard. As they burst through the main gate, Turner risked a look back. The castle wasn't just collapsing. It was aging. Towers that had stood for centuries were crumbling to dust in seconds. It was as if the temporal energy that had been sustaining it had been withdrawn, and all the centuries it had cheated came due at once. They made it to the tree line as the last of the structure dissolved into a mound of ancient rubble. The sleet stung their faces. The world was cold and real again. But as they moved to their extraction point, Turner saw it. A faint green tinge on the horizon, where the sun was struggling to break through the clouds. It was an illusion, he told himself. A trick of the light, a after-image from the explosion. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was not. Valerius had not been lying. They had set something in motion. The Battle of the Bulge was coming, and the Avalon group had stacked the deck. The world was fighting a war for its future, and they were already losing. December 19th, 1944. The forest was a cathedral of ice. Every branch, every needle of the dense Ardennes pines was encased in a glittering, transparent shell. The world had been silenced, frozen in a moment of terrible beauty. Sergeant Miles Turner crouched behind a fallen log, the cold seeping through his trousers, his breath a shallow cloud. He did not feel the cold, not in the way he should. Since the castle, since the confrontation with Valerius, the world felt thin, like a poorly projected film over a reality he was only just beginning to perceive. The others felt it too, a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the impending German offensive. It was the tension of a string being pulled too tight, a note held for too long, threatening to shatter. They were positioned on a ridge overlooking a critical road junction near the town of Streetvith. Their mission, handed to them by a harried-looking general who had no knowledge of Operation Looking Glass, was simple: hold this position, observe and report on enemy movements. A standard reconnaissance-in-force assignment. But Turner and his team knew the truth. This was the place. This was the point of divergence Valerius had boasted about. The intelligence from the castle download had been fragmented, horrifying. It spoke of temporal anchors and probability manipulation. The Avalon group hadn't just given the Germans weather reports and fuel locations. They had placed devices, small, innocuous-looking boxes, at key logistical and command points throughout the Ardennes. These devices, Lynx theorized, emitted a low-level chronometric field. It didn't change events directly. It influenced luck. It made German commanders just that much more decisive, their intuition sharper. It made American responses just that much slower, their communications slightly more garbled, their ammunition dumps just a fraction more vulnerable. It was warfare waged on the statistical probability of chance. "Movement," Petrenko whispered, his voice barely audible. The Russian was a statue, his cheek welded to the stock of his Mosin Nagant rifle, his scope scanning the white valley below. Half-tracks, infantry, many. Turner raised his binoculars. The column was there, just as history said it would be, grey-clad soldiers, moving with a purpose that seemed unnervingly confident for a force that was supposed to be desperate, low on fuel. But through the lenses, he saw something else. A faint, shimmering haze surrounded the lead vehicles. It was like heat haze off a desert road, but this was a frozen forest in December. It was a temporal distortion. A wake of altered reality. "See it?" Lynx murmured from beside him. She had her meter out, its needle dancing erratically. "The field is active. It's clinging to them. It's lubricating their advance." As they watched, American Sherman tank, hidden in a copse of trees at the edge of the road, opened fire. The shot was true, aimed directly at the lead German half-track. But at the last second, the half-track swerved, a seemingly impossible maneuver on the icy road. The shell screamed past, exploding harmlessly in the trees behind it. It was a 1-in-a-million miss. Under the influence of the Avalon field, 1 in a million odds were becoming commonplace. We have to find the anchor, Turner said, his jaw tight. The device powering this, it has to be close. Their orders were to observe. But their real mission, the one given to them by Albright and Finch, was to disrupt. To be a wrench in the Avalon Group's perfectly calculated machine, they moved off the ridge, descending into the frozen valley like ghosts. The sounds of battle grew louder, the crump of mortars, the staccato rhythm of machine guns, the screams of men. But these sounds had a strange, muffled quality to them, as if they were listening to a radio broadcast from another room. The temporal field was dampening the reality of the conflict, making it feel like a staged performance. They found the anchor 2 hours later. It was nestled in the basement of a shattered farmhouse that had been used as a temporary American command post. The house had been overrun. The bodies of GIs lay where they had fallen, their blood frozen black on the snow. But in the cellar, untouched by the fighting, was a small metallic box, humming softly. It was pulsing with the same sickly green light. Wires ran from it, not to any power source, but into the earth itself, as if drawing energy from the ley line Finch had theorized about. Macready, the engineer, knelt beside it, his tools already in hand. It's a resonator, like the one in the castle, but smaller, localized. It's amplifying the probability field for a 5-mile radius. He traced the wires with a gloved finger. It's also broadcasting, sending data back to a central source. Can you disable it? Turner asked, his carbine trained on the cellar stairs. Maybe. But it's booby, trapped. Not with explosives, with something else. Macready pointed to a series of crystalline filaments that surrounded the core. A chronometric feedback loop. If I disrupt it incorrectly, it could create a localized temporal rupture, a bubble of accelerated time, or reversed time, or something worse. As he spoke, the air in the cellar grew cold, colder than the winter outside. The hum from the device intensified, shifting in pitch. From the shadows in the corner, a figure began to coalesce. It was not a ghost from the past this time. It was a man in a modern US Army uniform, but it was fading in and out of existence, his form flickering between solid and translucent. He was looking at a map, speaking into a radio that wasn't there. Elements of the 106th are encircled. We need support at Schönberg. The voice was clear one moment, a garbled whisper the next. The man, a captain by his insignia, turned and looked directly at Turner. His eyes were wide with a terror that was hours old. Who are you? What are you doing in my CP? He was a chronal ghost, but not from a distant war. He was from this one, from the command post that had existed in this very cellar only hours before. The Avalon device was so powerful it was bleeding moments from the recent past into the present. Captain, Turner said, keeping his voice low and calm. We're here to help. The situation has changed. The captain's image flickered violently. Changed? They're everywhere. The reports were wrong. They're tanks. They came out of the fog. It wasn't natural fog. He clutched his chest, his form shuddering. I can't get through to command. The static, it sounds like, screaming, and then he was gone. The cellar was just a cellar again, cold and dark, save for the pulsing green light of the device. He was reliving his final moments, Lynx said, her face pale. The field is so strong here it's recording events, playing them back. This isn't just about influencing the future, it's desecrating the past. Macready now, Turner ordered, his patience gone. I don't care how you do it. Kill it. Macready nodded, his face set in a grim mask. He selected a pair of insulated wire cutters. The feedback loop is centered on these primary conduits. If I cut them in the correct sequence, it should cause a cascading failure, not an explosion. But it's a theory. It's all we have. Macready took a deep breath and went to work. His hands were steady, his movements precise. Snip. A conduit sparked and died. The hum wavered. Snip. Another. The green light flickered. The air in the cellar began to vibrate, a low-frequency tremor that made their teeth ache. From upstairs, the sounds of battle suddenly sharpened. The muffling effect was vanishing. They heard the distinct roar of a Panzer IV's main gun, much closer than before. The field is dropping, Lynx confirmed, watching her meter. The probability manipulation is ceasing. The device gave one last, violent pulse of green light, and then the light died. The hum ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the now clear and terrifyingly close sounds of the real battle. And then the cellar door exploded inward. A German soldier, a young Obergefreiter, stood framed in the doorway, his MP-40 submachine gun held ready. His eyes were wide, not with battle frenzy, but with a confused fear. He had been chasing an American straggler, seen the open cellar door, and thrown a grenade on instinct. He wasn't part of some grand, Avalon-manipulated plan. He was just a kid, caught in the storm. He saw them, saw the strange device, saw their non-standard uniforms. Confusion turned to alarm. He raised his weapon. There was no time for orders, for negotiation. Petrenko, who had been covering the door, fired once. The shot was clean, precise. The German soldier crumpled to the ground, a look of profound surprise on his face. The violence was sudden, final, and horribly mundane. It was a reminder that beneath the cosmic horror of the Avalon group, the war was still made of moments like this. A dark room, a surprised boy, a single bullet. "We're compromised," Wallace said, stating the obvious. "They'll have heard that." "Grab the device," Turner said. "All of it. Finch will want to study it." They gathered the now deactivated box, its wires trailing, and moved out of the cellar, stepping over the body of the German soldier. The world outside had changed. The faint green tinge was gone from the air. The battle sounds were raw and immediate, unfiltered. The statistical advantage had been stripped away. The fight for this crossroads was now a fair fight, or as fair as war ever got. As they melted back into the forest, Turner looked back at the farmhouse. For a split second, he saw it not as a shattered ruin, but as it had been hours before, intact, with American jeeps parked outside, the captain from the cellar standing on the porch, smoking a cigarette, utterly unaware of the doom that was rolling towards him through the frozen trees. The echo lingered, a scar on the present. They had won a small victory. They had neutralized one anchor, but Valerius had said there were others. The battle was vast, the front line a tangled, chaotic mess. The Avalon group was still out there, pruning the timeline, guiding history towards their desired future under a green Sunday, and as Turner led his team deeper into the winter forest, away from the immediate danger, a new sound reached his ears, carried on the frigid wind. It wasn't the sound of guns or engines, it was the sound of children laughing. It came from a village they had passed through that morning. A village that had been empty, deserted. Its inhabitants fled from the advancing Germans. The laughter was bright, carefree, and utterly, terrifyingly out of place. It was the sound of a past that never was, or a future that shouldn't be. It was the sound of the Avalon Group's work continuing, unimpeded. The battlefield was no longer just a piece of land. It was time itself, and every moment was a front line. March 15th, 1945. The smell was the first thing that hit them. It was not the smell of a city shattered by high explosives and firestorms. That smell, of cordite, burnt brick, and death, was familiar, almost mundane. This was different. It was a metallic smell, sharp and coppery, like the air after a lightning strike, but layered over with something sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit and ozone. It was the smell of time itself, rotting. Berlin was a landscape of broken teeth. The ruins of buildings stood against a sky perpetually grey with smoke and spring rain. Turner and his team moved through the skeletal remains of a city that was dying, yet somehow, in its death throes, felt more alive with malevolent energy than it ever had in life. They were ghosts in a ghost city, their purpose known only to the handful of men in London who held their file. The intelligence had come from a source so deep it had no name. A whisper on a captured German wire, a fragment of a signal that shouldn't have existed, pointing to a location in the heart of the Nazi capital. The Führer bunker was the obvious focus, the lair of a dying beast. But the Avalon group had always preferred the shadows just beyond the spotlight. Their facility, codenamed Zeitfalle Time Trap, was buried deep beneath the ruins of the Reichsbank, not to protect gold, but to protect something infinitely more valuable, their primary research. The war was lost for Germany. Everyone knew it. But for the Avalon group, the end of this war was merely a data point. Their work was transitioning from supporting a doomed regime to securing their own survival and dominance in the branches of time that would follow. Getting into the city had been a nightmare of dodging Russian patrols and desperate, fanatical SS squads. The front line was not a line at all, but a chaotic stew of advancing armies and collapsing defences. They were in a race against the Soviets, not for territory, but for a secret that could redefine the world to come. They found the entrance to the Reichsbank vaults through a collapsed sewer line, a route marked on a map provided by a terrified German cryptographer who had worked for the Avalon group and had a sudden, belated attack of conscience. The descent was into a darkness that felt ancient and hungry. The hum was here too, but it was different. It was deeper, more resonant, a chord played on the strings of reality itself. It was the sound of the wound in Normandy, grown up, matured into something far more powerful and controlled. The vaults were not filled with gold bars. They were filled with artifacts. The chamber was vast, lit by the same pulsating green light, but here the light was steady, confident. Row upon row of metal shelves stretched into the gloom, and on those shelves were objects that made no sense. A Roman gladius, its blade notched and bloodied, rested next to a sleek, matte black rifle that looked like it belonged 50 years in the future. A stack of clay tablets covered in cuneiform shared a shelf with a transparent cube inside which swirling nebulous lights danced. There was a vase from ancient Greece depicting a battle between hoplites and what looked like men in futuristic exoskeletons. A framed photograph showed a smiling Adolf Hitler shaking hands with a man whose features were blurred, indistinct, as if he existed in multiple states at once. "This is a museum," Lynx whispered, her voice full of awe and horror. "A museum of stolen time, not stolen," a new voice said from the shadows. It was Professor Finch. He had insisted on coming on this mission, despite Albright's protests. The theoretical had become far too real for him to observe from the safety of London. His face was gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "Collected. These are trophies, proof of concept. Each one is an object displaced from its native timeline. The Avalon group isn't just observing branches. They are actively looting them. Macready was already at a central console, larger and more complex than any they had seen before. It was a symphony of glowing vacuum tubes, spinning metal discs, and crystalline arrays that pulsed in rhythm with the hum. "This is the core," he said, his fingers flying over a keyboard. "The master control for their entire temporal operation. It's beautiful." "It's an abomination," Turner growled, his carbine scanning the darkness between the shelves. The place felt watched. "Can you shut it down? Shut it down?" Finch laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "My dear Sergeant, this is the most significant discovery in human history. This console doesn't just open doors, it maps the entire tree of probability. It shows every decision, every chance event, every possible outcome of this war, and 1,000 others. We can't destroy it. We must learn from it. We must control it." "That wasn't the mission, Professor," Turner said, his tone flat. "The mission is to deny it to the enemy." "The enemy?" Finch turned to him, his eyes wide. "Don't you see? There are no enemies here anymore. There is only knowledge. With this, we could end all wars. We could prevent this very conflict from ever happening. We could create a utopia." The hum in the room seemed to pulse in agreement with Finch's words. It was seductive. Turner could feel it himself, a whisper at the back of his mind. Why fight? Why struggle? With this, you could have gone home before the war even started. You could have saved every man who died in that bunker in Normandy. He shook his head, fighting the insidious thought. "That's what they thought. Look where it got them." He gestured at the grotesque collection around them. Lynx, who had been interfacing her equipment with the console, let out a sharp gasp. "Sir, I'm in their main log. Project Januskopf was just the beginning. This is Project Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods," Schmidt translated, his voice grim. "They're not trying to prune a branch," Lynx continued, her face illuminated by the scrolling data on her screen. "They're trying to burn the whole tree. They've identified our timeline, this one, as a hostile route. A timeline that naturally produces too much resistance, too much chaos, too many variables that oppose their control. They're going to trigger a cascade failure." "How?" Turner asked, the cold knot returning to his stomach. "A paradox," Finch breathed, his theoretical excitement giving way to dawning horror. "A grandfather paradox on a geopolitical scale. They're going to send an artifact back, a very specific artifact." Lynx zoomed in on a file. It was schematics for a device. A nuclear bomb, but its design was unlike anything the Manhattan Project had conceived. It was smaller, more elegant, infinitely more powerful, and it was stamped with the insignia of the Soviet Union. "They're going to send a Soviet strategic nuclear weapon back to 1939, she said, her voice trembling, "and detonate it over Berlin at the exact moment Hitler invades Poland." The sheer apocalyptic scale of the plan stole the air from the room. The paradox would be unimaginable. A Soviet nuke destroying Berlin before the war even properly began? The fabric of cause and effect would tear itself apart. The resulting temporal shockwave would not just erase their timeline, it would unravel the very concept of the Second World War, creating a chaotic, mangled knot of reality, from which only the Avalon Group, safe in their citadels outside of time, could possibly emerge intact. Everyone else, every soldier who had fought, every life lost or saved, would be rendered a never was. "We have to stop it," Turner said. It was no longer an order. It was a prayer. "The device is already primed," Macready said from the console. "It's in a separate, shielded chamber. The launch sequence is initiated. It's counting down." "How long?" Macready looked up, his face ashen. 15 minutes. The race was on. The chamber containing the device was at the far end of the vault, behind a door of reinforced titanium. Their explosives wouldn't be enough. The only way to stop it was from the master console, but as they turned to confront the machine, the shadows at the edge of the chamber moved. They were not chronal ghosts. They were solid, real. Men and women in the stark white uniforms of the Avalon Group Security Corps. They were armed not with rifles, but with devices that looked like oversized pistols with crystalline prongs at the end. Their leader stepped forward. It was Director Valerius, Sergeant Turner. Valerius said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "You are a remarkable constant. A fly in the ointment, a variable we have had to recalculate for again and again, but this is the final equation. There is no place for you in the world to come." The Avalon Guards raised their weapons. They didn't fire bullets. They fired pulses of distorted air, waves of temporal force. One caught Wallace square in the chest. He didn't scream, he aged. In the space of a second, he withered, his uniform rotting on his body, his skin desiccating to parchment, until he collapsed into a pile of dust and bones. Another pulse hit Petrenko. He reversed, his body growing younger, smaller, until he was a toddler in an oversized uniform, crying in confusion for a moment before winking out of existence entirely. It was not death, it was erasure. Turner and the others dove for cover behind the metal shelves, the strange artifacts rattling around them. Bullets were useless against these weapons. They were fighting with time itself as the battlefield. "Macready, the console!" Turner yelled, firing his carbine at the Avalon Guards to little effect. The bullets seemed to slow and drop harmlessly to the ground a few feet from their targets, caught in a localized time dilation field. "I'm trying," Macready shouted back, his hands a blur on the keyboard. "I can abort the sequence, but their security protocols are locking me out. I need a systems override, a physical key." Lynx, crouched next to him, scanned the console frantically. "There! The primary server rack. It has a hard-wired override terminal, but it's on the other side of the chamber." It was a suicide run. A 20-meter sprint across open ground, directly through the Avalon Group's line of fire. Turner didn't hesitate. He looked at Schmidt, then at Lynx and Macready. "Cover me." He broke from cover, running not in a straight line but in a weaving, unpredictable pattern. The air around him crackled with temporal energy. He felt a wave of heat and cold simultaneously pass through him, and for a terrifying second he saw his own hands become those of an old man. He saw the floor in front of him ripple, becoming the cobblestones of a medieval street before snapping back to concrete. A temporal pulse struck a shelf next to him. The artifacts on it, a World War I helmet and a futuristic data slate, fused together into a single, impossible lump of matter. He was almost there. He could see the server rack, a monolithic structure of blinking lights and wires. Valerius watched him, a look of mild annoyance on his face. He raised his own weapon, a more refined version of the guard's, aiming it with calm precision. But before he could fire, a shot rang out. Not from Turner's team, from the entrance to the vault. A squad of Soviet soldiers, their uniforms filthy from street fighting, stood there, their PPS-4-1 submachine guns raised. They had found the entrance. Their commander, a hard-faced captain, stared in disbelief at the scene before him. The green light, the strange artifacts, the men in white uniforms. For a split second, everyone froze. The Avalon Group had not calculated for this. The Russians were a variable of pure, chaotic chance. That second was all Turner needed. He reached the server rack, found the override terminal, a simple red-button switch under a protective glass case. He didn't think about the consequences, about Finch's dreams of utopia. He thought of the bones in Normandy. He thought of Kessler. He thought of a world where none of it had ever happened. He smashed the glass with the butt of his carbine and slammed the switch. Alarms blared. The steady green light turned to a frantic, strobing red. The deep hum became a screeching whine of protesting machinery. "Sequence aborted," Macready yelled. "The device is standing down." Valerius let out a roar of pure fury. The calm, superior facade shattered. "You fool, you've condemned your entire world to a slow, grinding death. You had a chance for a clean end." He turned his weapon on the Soviet soldiers and fired. A wave of temporal force hit them. They didn't age or reverse, they simply unraveled, their forms dissolving into their constituent atoms, their screams cut short into static. "Retreat!" Valerius commanded his guards. "To the escape conduit. We will finish this from another branch." The Avalon Group members began to fall back, firing their temporal weapons to cover their escape. They moved towards a section of the wall that shimmered, a solid-looking door irising open into a tunnel of swirling, non-Euclidean light. Turner raised his carbine, aiming at Valerius's back. He fired. The bullet flew true. It struck Valerius in the shoulder. But instead of blood, a spray of golden, luminous particles erupted from the wound. Valerius staggered, but did not fall. He turned, his pale eyes locking with Turner's one last time. There was no pain in them, only a promise of infinite vengeance. Then he stepped into the light, and the door irised shut behind him, leaving only solid, unbroken concrete. The chamber was suddenly, deafeningly silent, save for the blaring alarms and the dying whine of the console. The master control was dead. The Avalon Group was gone. The Soviet squad was gone. Wallace and Petrenko were gone. They had stopped the paradox. They had saved their timeline. But as Turner looked around at the museum of stolen time, at the dead console, at the dust that had been his comrades, he knew it was not a victory. It was a stay of execution. Valerius was still out there. The Avalon Group was still out there, in the infinite branches of the tree, waiting, plotting. The war in Europe would be over in a matter of weeks. But for Miles Turner, the war, the true war, had just become infinite.